Key rebinding is a nice to have it in game, and for some players, it's a must have in a game. So in this video, we're going to look at creating a key rebinding system that's going to work with Unity's new input system, and in particular, it's going to work with the C# generated class. If you're not using the C# generated class and you're using the scriptable object that Unity generates, the input action asset, then I would encourage you to go look at Unity's sample package. Their system works really nicely with that scriptable object. It does not work with the C# generated class. And also one other caveat, the system that I'm going to build here is going to have more functionality than that system, but an awful lot of what I'm going to do here can be applied to their system as well. So before we get started, I also want to point out one major issue that I ran into, or a confusing point. And that being that when you create an input action asset, Unity is creating a scriptable object. And then when you generate C# code, or Unity generates that C# code from that input action asset, that C# class and that scriptable object do not talk to each other at edit time or at runtime. And so that does cause some problems, and we need to be really clear which one we're using when. We're going to be using the scriptable object in our inspector to be able to pick our exact action and binding. And then during runtime, we're going to be rebinding on the C# generated class because that's what our game objects are going to be using. So before we get started, let's take a quick tour of the scene. You can see down here, I have my input action asset. I've called it rebind jumping, and it has just one simple action. That's a jump, and it's got two bindings, one for the keyboard and one for the gamepad. You can also see up here in my canvas that I have these two prefabs. If we go take a closer look at these here, you can see here that we've got this action text, a rebind button, and a reset button. So again, this is going to allow us to display to the player exactly what action we're rebinding. The rebind button itself will display the current binding for that action. And then the reset binding will allow the player to reset whatever they may have done back to what you as a developer set by default. This UI prefab is pretty simple, so I'm not going to take the time to build that up in this video. But what's going to be happening here is that this UI prefab is going to have a component that we will be building up. And it takes input from both you, the developer, when you create it, and the player as they're rebinding their keys. It's then packaging up that information and sending it off to an input manager, which is going to have a static reference to the input action asset. And that's where the rebinding is actually going to happen. That's the big picture of how our system is going to work here. Before we get in too deep, I do want to also look at the jump controller. And this is just a very, very simple implementation of Unity's new input system. So what we have here, we have an instance of the rebinding jumping input action asset. And then on the onEnable function, we create an instance of that. We subscribe to one of the events. We enable that action. And then down here in the do jump, we're just applying a add force so that we get this appearance of the object jumping up and down. And again, that's applied just to this red capsule here in the game view. And again, if you're not familiar with Unity's new input system, check out my earlier video that covers the basics of that and is very much explains what's going on in this script. We will have to come back to this jump controller and change one line there to make use of our key rebinding functionality. Okay, so enough intro. First thing we need to do is create a new C# class for our UI component, and I'm going to call it ReBind UI. So in this class, the first thing we need to do is add in a few namespaces. Most importantly, we need to add in the input system. We're also going to need to add in UI system so we can reference our text and our buttons. And if you're going to use Text Mesh Pro, which looks much nicer, you're going to want to add in that TM Pro namespace as well. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to work with the built-in text component, but nothing changes if you're going to use Text Mesh Pro, other than it's going to look nicer. I'm going to get rid of the start and update, and then we need to add in several fields here, and I'll try to explain them as we go along. First one is going to be private and serialized. Input action reference. Now, this was a little bit new to me. This is not something we've looked at in earlier videos, but this is going to allow you as the developer to select not only the input action asset, but the action that you want to rebind, which is pretty convenient. It's also really important. So this reference that we're getting is part of the scriptable object. So again, we're going to be going back and forth between the scriptable object. We're going to be pulling information on that so that you can choose the correct action binding. Then we're going to be sending that information to the input manager, which has reference to the generated C# input action asset. So we're playing a little bit of a shell game, getting data from one, sending it to another one, but it works pretty well. Next thing we're going to do is create a Boolean here. that is going to allow us to exclude the mouse. I'm going to set it equal to true. Again, that gives you, the developer, some flexibility to say, hey, this binding, I don't want the player to accidentally assign the mouse to it. So they're not moving left when they push the right mouse button just by accident. I totally did that when I was doing some testing. Next thing we're going to do is add in a slider. I'm going to have it go from 0 to 10. It's also going to be serialized. It's going to be a private integer. Now, this is where it gets a little bit janky. So without creating a custom inspector, whether that's with Unity's built-in tools or something like Odin, we got to be a little clever here. What we need to be able to do is select the actual binding. So, and I'll put it up on the screen, but you can see that each action can have multiple bindings below it, and we need to select which one we want to do the rebinding to. And this is the least janky way I've found to do it. So I'm creating a slider that's going to go from 0 to 10. If for some reason you have more than 10 bindings, you're going to need to make that value bigger. And this is going to be the selected binding like so. Then we're going to have yet another serialized field. All these fields are going to be private and serialized. We're going to have an input binding display string options. And we're going to call it display string options like so. And this is just a nice built-in enum that'll allow us to format the binding name so the player can see something that looks nice and is fairly human readable. It's just a nice to have type of thing. So far, we've able to select the binding, but you as the developer, it's tricky to know which binding you selected. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to put a header on it. Call it binding info. Info. Do not edit. And this is, again, for your use. It'll allow you to see what binding you have selected. So input binding. Like so. And lastly, we're going to have one more integer here, and this is the binding index. And we have another integer here that sounds very similar to our selected binding, but this is going to be the actual binding of the index, because in the inspector, you can move that slider wherever you want. It's possible that you could choose a value such that that binding does not exist. Whereas this variable is going to store the actual binding. We're going to have a little bit of idiot checking to make sure that if you have 9 in the inspector, we're not trying to change binding 9 if that binding doesn't exist. Hope that makes sense. We're also going to have a private string. This does not need to be serialized because we don't need to see it. We don't want to change it. This is going to be the action name. And this is, again, key here. We're going to be storing the action as a string. Now, the reason we're storing the action as a string and not the action itself is because the action that we're finding is on the scriptable object, but we don't want to rebind that action. So what we're going to do instead is take this action name, send it over to the input manager. The input manager is going to then look up that action on the C# generated class and then return and cache that action because that's where we want to do the rebinding. Last thing we're going to do, I'm going to put in another header just to make it look nice and easy to read and use. I'm going to add in a bunch of UI fields here. I have a text here. This is going to be our action text. I have a button. This is going to be our rebind button. We're also going to have a rebind text. This is the text that's on that rebind button. That'll allow the player to know what has been assigned, what is assigned, or what has been assigned when they changed it. And the last one is another button. This is going to be the reset button. So the player can press a button and again go back to that default binding that you, the developer, have set. Now, one of my goals here is to make this as user-friendly as possible, again, without a custom inspector or using something like Odin. So we're going to add in a onValidate function. Now, if you've never used the onValidate function, this is a function that gets called whenever something in the inspector changes. Now, it doesn't get called when you go into play mode or anything like that, but anytime you change something in the inspector, this function is going to get called. And what that's going to allow us to do is you, the developer, or me showing you how my system works, when I choose an input action reference, we can then update the rest of the inspector with the appropriate values. Just makes it feel good, and it's a whole lot easier to use. So we're going to call 2 functions here, and we're going to have to create those functions, but we're going to get binding info, and we're going to update the UI. So anytime something changes, we're going to go get the binding info and update the UI. So first off, we're going to create this get binding function like that. And in here, again, what we need to do is, so you've selected this action in the inspector. Now we need to go get the binding, make sure that it actually exists. First thing we're going to do, we're going to Check and make sure that the action actually exists. If it does, we're going to set the action name like that. So now we're storing the action name, not the action itself. And then we need to go see if this binding that you've selected with the slider exists. So input action reference, action bindings. This is an array of all the bindings. We're going to check the count of this and make sure that it's bigger than the selected binding. So this is where we try to make it a little bit idiot proof again. So if you slide it all the way over to 10 and there isn't a 10th binding, keeps it a little bit safer. We're going to set input binding to input action reference, action bindings, selected binding, like so. And again, that's for your visual update or visual feedback. Binding index equals select binding. So here's where we are setting the actual index that we're going to be sending off to input manager to the value that you selected in the inspector. All right, so let's make our update UI function. And like that. We're going to check and see if the action text is not null. If it's not null, we're going to update it with the action name. And we're same kind of idea. We're going to check if the rebind text is not null. And if it's not, we're going to do some stuff here. So what we want to do here is we want to keep the text on the rebind button up to date. Now, when we're in edit mode, we want to grab that information off the scriptable object. When we're in play mode, we're going to grab it off the C# generated class. That just makes sure we're always dealing with the correct information. The player and or the developer, you can see the same and correct information. So we're going to check if application is plain. If it is, we're going to grab info from input manager. We don't have that functionality right now. We're going to create that later when we get to the input manager. Otherwise, we're going to say rebind text equals input action reference action get binding display name, which is a nice extension given to us by Unity to create a nice human readable version of the binding name. And we're going to pass in the binding index. So always a good habit. Let's go back into Unity and let's make sure this is working, and you can see how this all plays out in Unity. I'm going to go to my prefab here and I'm going to add this ReBind UI to it. So at the top here, you can see the input action reference. So if I click the circle here, you can see all the various actions that I have in my project from past videos and tutorials. I'm going to choose this top one, which is my games control or game controls jump, like so. And then if I open up the input binding, you can see the binding here. I can see that it's right now we're going to be rebinding the keyboard space bar. And if I move that, you'll see that that'll update. But if I slide it over and that binding doesn't exist, nothing gets updated. Also, we got our display string options here. For what I found, none works pretty well, but you can play around those and get exactly what you want. Then let's assign our UI elements here. So I'm going to drag in the action text, rebind button, text on that button, and the reset button as well. Now, if this is working right, if I slide this back and forth, you can see the UI over there in the game view is changing and reflecting which button or which binding we're going to be doing the rebinding for. So here is the keyboard. So it says space, slide it over. It's A, which is the south button on the gamepad. That's pretty slick. I really like how well this works. The slider's a bit janky, but it does work and it's pretty easy to use as a developer. All right, so let's go back into our rebind code and add a few more details to it and more or less polish that up. We'll have to come back to it towards the end, but let's go do that. So a few things here. You may have seen a warning or error came up. I'm going to go back here to my on validate, and we need to check and make sure that our input action reference, if it's null, we just want to return. We don't want to update these other bits and pieces. It's not a big deal, but if you don't have that, it will throw errors in edit mode, as you may have noticed. Next thing we need to do is set up our buttons so that they actually do something. So I'm going to do rebind button on click, add listener, and then we're going to feed in our delegate. And this is going to be do rebind like so. And we're going to do the same thing for our reset button on click, add listener. And this will be reset binding like so. And extra parentheses. And it's just objecting here because those functions have not been defined. We'll do that here in just a bit. So the other thing we want to do is when we go into play mode, we want to make sure that our UI and all our values in the inspector are reflecting the correct values. Sometimes when you go into play mode, you can lose those. So we're going to check and make sure that our action reference is not null. And if it's not, we're going to get our binding info and update UI like so. And we'll come back and we're going to add, again, a little bit more functionality to it. That is the bulk of what we want to do. Then we're going to come and deal with these, create these functions here. So private do rebind like so, and private void reset binding. And for now, I'm going to leave those two functions blank because we need to create the functionality in the input manager, and we're going to call some of those functions from this component, but we don't have those yet, so we're going to leave it as is. So like a lot of things that I like to do, I want to build this up in levels of functionality. We're going to start with the base level of functionality so that if that's all you need, you can stop the video and take it and implement it. If you want to keep going further, keep watching more and we'll keep implementing new functionality. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off with obviously implementing the basic rebinding functionality. We're then going to add the ability to rebind composites. Again, so that's like WASD. If you have a composite input, you can have just one UI element. The player can press it once and then rebind all the pieces of the composite, which is nice. We're going to add in C# events so that when you start the rebinding process or cancel the rebinding process or complete the rebinding process, an event can get called and other parts of your system or other parts of your game can be notified that that happens. So if you want to play a sound effect, maybe you want to trigger some UI, so there's an overlay, whatever you need or want to do will be pretty easy to do. We're also going to add in the functionality to save a binding. So if the player changes something, we can save that value and then reload it the next time they play, so they don't have to set up the bindings every time they play the game. So here in the input manager, we're going to get rid of the start and update functions. We just don't need them. But what we do really need to create is a public static reference to our input action asset. And in my case, I've called that rebind jumping. And you're going to need to put in the type and the name of your class in there. I'm going to call this input actions like so. Next, I'm going to add an awake function. And in here, I'm going to check and see if input actions is null. And if it is, we're going to create a new instance of it like so. Now, the reason I'm checking to see if it's null is I've ended up with some race conditions and some functions we're going to create later down where it's dependent, that function is dependent on this static instance. I'm not sure why I'm getting race conditions with an awake, but this is just a little bit of a safety check. And I don't want to accidentally create multiple instances of this input action asset. I want to make sure there's only one, and I don't want to override it, because if I rebind to input action asset and then create a new instance of it, it's going to get rid of all those bindings, and it's going to be really hard to, not hard to debug necessarily, but confusing and just not work the way we want it to. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a private static function, and this is going to be the do rebind. Now, I am creating this as a private function because I'm going to have another function that actually going to call this one. We're going to have some other kind of like pre-sorting that's going to help us deal with composite bindings. If you don't want to do composite functions, make this function public, and this is what you're going to call from the Rebind UI component that we just created. But before we get too much further here, I forgot to add in some namespaces, so I'm going to add in using Unity engine.input system. I'm going to add in using Unity engine.ui. And because we're going to add in actions or events, I'm going to add in using system like so. That just allows us to use that shortcut of creating an action rather than having to create a delegate and then an instance of that delegate. Okay, so back to the do rebind, we're going to add in an input action. And this is going to be the action to rebind. We're going to have a binding index. This is the binding that we are redoing. And we're going to pass in status text, or so this is the text of the button that the player is pressing, just giving them a little bit of feedback as to what's going on as we progress through this. We are going to come back and add some more parameters here as we add more functionality, but for now, this is going to do it. So first thing we want to do, we want to make sure that this action to rebind is not null. And we also want to make sure that our binding index is valid. So it's got to be greater than 0. If either of these aren't true, we're going to return, we're done. Next thing we're going to do is just a little bit of quality of life for your players. I don't think this is a fully developed idea here. but it is kind of nice. We're going to update the text on the button. So when you press it, you give the player some feedback. Hey, we're looking for a button. We're looking for the kind of control type that we're telling them what kind of control type should go in there. Adding a string, press, and then we're going to do action, rebind, expected control type. And again, I really think this piece could use some refinement, but it's a good start and a little bit of feedback to the player. Also, as soon as they press the button, the text on it changes, which is a nice, again, just feedback for the player. In order to do rebinding, we need to disable the action that we're rebinding, really important, and we'll re-enable it when we're done with the rebinding. So disable it like so. And then we need to create an instance of this rebinding action. And so to do that, we're going to create a new variable, rebind, action to rebind, and then we're going to make use of a extension function that Unity has for us, which is perform interactive rebind. And we're going to feed in this binding index like so. Now, it's important to note that this command, this function, does not start the rebinding. It just creates an instance of this process or this object that's going to be doing the rebinding for us. And the vast majority of that work is going on behind the scenes created by Unity, but we do need to create an instance of it. The next thing we need to do is we need to create the behavior of this rebind process. Most notably, we need to define what it does when that rebind process is complete and when it's canceled. So we're going to do rebind dot on complete. And this is where we get a little bit of complex notation if you're not used to delegates. We're going to have open parentheses operation, and then we're going to assign this delegate like so, and make sure we put just to avoid the error, we're going to put a semicolon at the end. So what we need to do here is when this operation is complete, when the rebinding is complete, we need to take this action and we need to enable it. We also need to get rid of this operation. So if we don't call this dispose function, Unity's not going to get rid of this operation and we can have a memory leak. Generally, Unity and C#, they do all the garbage collection for us. In this case, we need to tell it, hey, we're all done, clean this up. We're also going to define the on cancel. And we're going to do the same thing like so. And for right now, I'm actually going to copy these exact same lines and copy and paste them in there. We are going to come back to the on complete in particular and add some functionality as we go. But in both cases, when we've completed or canceled our rebinding, we want to re-enable action, and we want to get rid of the rebind operation itself so we clean out our memory. The last thing we need to do here, we need to do rebind. We need to do rebind start. And this actually starts the rebinding process. So if you just want a bare bones rebinding system, this function is most of what you need. You would need to change it to a public function and call it from the ReBind UI. And you also need to actually get a reference to this input action. Remember, our UI component only has the name of the action, whereas this function is taking in the actual action. So there's a little bit of work that you need to do, but we're going to do that in the next function, which is also going to add in functionality to deal with composite inputs. So the next function we're going to add in is actually going to start the rebind process. And what it's going to do is check and see if we're rebinding a composite binding. And I have more or less stolen this straight from Unity's sample. It works. It's great. So I'm going to create a new public static function. And it's going to be called start rebind. And in this thing, we're going to take in the action name. We're going to take in the binding index. And we're going to take in the text, the status text. And again, this is the function that's actually going to get called from our UI component. First thing we need to do is we need to get this actual action. So input action. And the way we get that action is we look at our input action asset. We go to the asset part of it and find action, and we can look it up by name. So again, I've said it a whole bunch of times, but what we're doing here is getting that action off of the C# generated script, not the scriptable object, which is what the UI object has reference to. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to check and make sure that this action isn't null. We're also going to check and see if this binding index that we've sent in here is valid. And the way we do that, we go to action.bindings, which is an array. We check the count of it, and we make sure that it's less than or equal to the binding index. If that's not true, we're going to print a warning, just a log. Couldn't find action or binding and return. Again, that's just to help you as the developer. The likely cause of running into this problem is that you have dropped in the wrong input action asset into your UI component, and your input manager here is referencing a different input action asset. If that's not true, if we're good to go, then what we need to do is we're going to check and see if this action, or more particularly the binding, so action.bindings at that particular binding index, we're going to see, is it a composite? And if it is, we're going to do a bunch of stuff. If it's not, what we're going to do is we're going to call this do rebind, and we're going to pass in the action, we're going to pass in the binding index and the status text. Like so. If it is a composite, we got to do a little bit of tricky work, and I'll put this up on the screen here. So a composite binding is actually a whole bunch of bindings put together. So if you look at the WASD binding, that's the first binding, but the up, down, left, right are bindings after it. So if we're going to rebind a composite, what we're actually feeding in is the binding for that WASD binding. And what we need to do is do multiple rebindings for each of the sub bindings. And to do that, we've got to do some work with our indices. So we're going to create a variable, first part index, and this is the binding index plus 1. So again, we don't want to be doing the rebinding for the WASD part. We want to be doing it for the up or the down or whatever binding comes after that, which is why we're adding 1. We then want to check and see, is this index, does it exist? So we're going to do action, bindings, count. And we also want to make sure that that binding is in fact a composite. So we do action, bindings, feed this in, first part index is composite. So we're making sure that that binding exists and that it's a composite. If neither of those are true, we don't want to do anything more. If those are both true, we just want to do our do rebind. We're going to pass in our action, our binding index, and our status text like so. But here's the problem. We need to differentiate between this call here and this call here. And we're going to do that by creating a new Boolean. So down here in our do rebind, we're going to create a new Boolean, and we're going to do all composite parts like so. And then up here, we're going to do true. And here we do false, which is great. So now we're telling our do rebind function whether it's a composite or not, but our do rebind isn't doing anything different. So down in the do rebind, in the on complete behavior, we're going to expand that and check if it's all composite parts. And if it is, we need to do some more work with our indices. Create a new variable. We call this next binding index. And this is going to be the binding index that we sent in plus 1. And then we're going to check and see next binding index, make sure that that binding exists. And we want to make sure that that binding is in fact a composite. If that's true, we're going to call do rebind again. We're going to pass in the same action. We're going to pass in this new binding index and pass the status text. And we're going to pass in all composite parts, just like we did before. So we're playing with indices here. We're calling functions from within functions. But what we're really doing here is working our way down this binding list, increasing the binding by 1, checking to see if that next binding is a composite. If it is, we send that binding into this do rebind function to rebind that. And again, what this allows our player to do is click on that composite button once and then rebind the up, down, left, right without having to click on the UI again, which is pretty nice quality of life thing for your player. So with that done, we should be able to jump back into our Rebind UI, call this public start rebind function, and test this out and see if this is working. We're going to come down here to the do rebind, and here we're going to call input manager start rebind. We're going to pass in the action name, the binding index, and the rebind text like so. Then to really test this, we're going to come back to our jump controller here, and this is where we're going to do some changing here. This is the kind of the one thing that I need to change with this jump controller. Rather than create a new instance of this rebinding input action asset, I'm going to reference the input manager input actions like so. And that's it. Let's go back into Unity and see how well this works. The thing I always forget to do, and we're not going to talk about how often I did it while I was trying to film this tutorial, we need to put our input manager into the scene. So I'm going to create a new empty object. I'm going to name it managers, and I'm going to drag the input manager onto it like so. We go into play mode, we should be able to test this out. So if I press the space bar, we're jumping like so. If I click on the UI object up here to rebind it, it says press a button, which is that feedback. So I'm going to press B to jump. Now notice here that the UI is not updating. We don't have that functionality in there quite yet. But if I come back to my game, I can now press B and I'm re-jumping. And if I press space, nothing happens at all. So our rebinding is working. Other thing to note, and we're going to fix this, if I come back into play mode, my rebinding is once again set to the spacebar, not to that rebound button. We're going to fix all of that as we go along. So next thing I want to add in is those C# events, and that's going to allow us to update the UI when the rebind is complete. So I'm going to scroll up here to the top, and we're going to create those new actions. I'm going to create 3 actions. The first one is static event action rebind complete, like so. And then likewise, another public static event, rebind canceled. And the last one is going to have some parameters in it. And what we're going to send here is the input action. We're actually going to, this is the action that had something done to it. We're going to send out the integer as well, the binding for it. And this is going to be the rebind started. So if you want to say have an overlay that pops up, that blocks all the other input and tells the player what's going on, hey, you're rebinding this action and this is what's currently assigned, this is the event that would be helpful because we're going to send out that action and the integer for the binding index. So you'll be able to access all that in the UI or whatever else you might want that to be accessed from. So we're going to come on down here to our rebind function here, and we're going to put these events, or rather we're going to invoke these events in here. So uncompleted, we're going to have rebind complete and check and see if anybody subscribed to it. If they are, we're going to invoke like so. And then same kind of idea down here, rebind canceled, check to see if anybody subscribed and invoke. And lastly, down here, rebind started. We're going to do the same kind of thing. This time we're going to pass in the action that's being rebound along with the binding index like that. So with those events put in place, we now can make use of them. We can tie into them. So we're going to come back to our ReBind UI. In the on enable, we're going to subscribe to the rebind complete, and we're going to add in the update UI like so. And then just to be nice and tidy, we're going to make sure we unsubscribe from that. So I'm going to copy that line and we're going to unsubscribe like so. Again, if you're not used to C# events, check out my earlier video on that. Walk through this whole idea of what events and actions and delegates are and how to subscribe and unsubscribe. So now we're subscribed to those things. We can update our UI, but we have a problem here. It's right here. So when the application is in play mode, we need to grab the information off the C# script, not off the scriptable object. And we can only do that from the input manager. So we need to create another static function where we can go grab that information. So let's jump back over to our input manager. Come here down to the bottom. I'm going to create a public static string. So we're going to be returning a string, get binding name. And we're going to do that by passing in the action name and the integer for the binding index, like so. And again, we're going to check and see here if our input actions is null. And this is where I mentioned before I was getting some race conditions. I'm not entirely sure why, but I was. So we're going to check and see if that input actions is null. If it is, we're going to create a new instance of it. We're then going to go see if we can get our action. So input actions asset find action, and we're going to pass in that action name like so. And then we're going to return this action, but we're going to use an extension function of get it bindings display string, and we're going to pass in the display, or sorry, we're going to pass in the binding index, little brain fart there, like so. Going back and forth pretty quickly here, but back to the rebinding. And in here, we're going to say rebind text.text equals input manager get binding name, and we're going to pass in the action name and the binding index like so. So if we go into Unity here, let's test that functionality. I click here, I press spacebar, and I'm jumping. If I do my rebinding, press it to B, I press B, and we're jumping. And one thing you should note here, now if I press that rebinding button and I press one of the buttons on my gamepad, it's going to rebind it to that, and which is totally fine. I can now jump using my gamepad. But in some cases, you may want to have keyboard specific bindings and game pad specific bindings. So let's set that up. It's not that hard. So if you don't want the functionality of being able to rebind either a keyboard or a gamepad to a particular binding, you want to keep them separate. And it's not a bad idea to do that. We need to create a control scheme. And we do that here in the input action asset. You can see here, mine says no control schemes. I'm going to add a control scheme. I'm going to call the first one keyboard. And then I'm going to add in the devices. I'm going to add in a keyboard and I'm going to add in a mouse as well, like so. And I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to also create another control scheme. I'm going to call this gamepad. And likewise, I'm going to add in a gamepad to that. And then here in my bindings, I need to assign which control scheme. So on the space bar, that's going to be part of the keyboard. And you'll notice that disappears because over here, I'm filtering by which control schemes to show. So I'm going to come back here to all control schemes. And then I'm going to come down to the south button, and that's going to be part of the gamepad. Now, if we come back up here and go into play mode, we have all the same functionality. I can rebind the keyboard, no problem. But if I get my gamepad and I rebind, it doesn't work. And that's because the binding that we originally set up was set up for the keyboard, which is now part of a different control scheme. And so it's only going to allow devices from that particular control scheme. I can actually click my mouse button, and now it says left mouse button. And now I jump every time I click the left mouse button. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to allow the player to cancel the rebinding, and we're going to allow you, the developer, to exclude particular devices from a rebinding operation. So back here in the input manager, I'm going to be working here in the do rebind function. And what we need to do is add in functionality to our rebind operation. So I'm going to come down here towards the bottom. And what we're going to do is add in a rebind with canceling through. So here's, again, where I don't love some of the design choices of Unity. Maybe it was the only way to do it. We have to type in a string. We need to tell it which input to cancel. So I'm going to type in, for my use case, the keyboard. Important that the keyboard is capitalized / escape, like so. So this way, when you're in the middle of a rebind, you press escape, cancel it. Hey, I didn't want to do that. Makes a lot of sense. If you want to use a button on the gamepad to cancel a rebinding, you're going to have to add in another one of these lines or have some additional logic to add that device or that input to cancel it. Then we're also going to add in the ability to exclude particular devices. In my case, I'm just going to exclude the mouse. Again, if you want to exclude other things like the left stick or the right stick or sticks in general or buttons, that works very much the same. You're just going to put in a different string. So I'm going to check and see here if we're exclude the mouse, which is not defined yet, but we'll go up and define this. And then we're going to do rebind with exclude, or with controls excluding. I always get it wrong. And in here, we're going to put in mouse. Again, it's capital M for the name of the device. And that will allow us to exclude the mouse so that you can't accidentally rebind the jump to one of your mouse buttons. So what I want to do next is define this variable exclude mouse. And I'm going to do that by creating a new parameter in the do rebind function here. It's going to be a Boolean exclude mouse, like so. And that's going to throw an error down here where we are calling the do rebind for a composite. So we're going to add that parameter to that function call. And then, of course, that causes problems up here on our start rebind. So we're going to add another parameter to that function as well. And then copy and paste that down into it here. So we're just passing that value along as we go. But this, of course, is going to cause a problem over on our ReBind UI where we're calling the start rebind function. So I'm going to come over to the ReBind UI, come down here, and here we're going to pass in the exclude mouse, which was already defined when we started all of this. The other issue that we have is that when we cancel a rebind action, we need to refresh the UI. We need to update it. So I'm going to come up here to the on enable. We're going to add in input manager, rebind canceled plus equals update UI. I'm going to copy that down here to the on disable and unsubscribe like so. So let's go into Unity and see how well that's working. If I go into play mode, I can jump. If I start the rebind process and press escape, you can see my UI is refreshed and I'm still using my spacebar to jump. If I start the rebind process, I can still assign a different button. I can jump. If I do it and click my mouse, you can see I'm clicking my mouse. It doesn't rebind it because over in our prefab, in our rebind UI, we have the exclude mouse option toggled on. Okay, so I know this is getting long and maybe I should have broken this up into chunks, but we're going to add in one more chunk of functionality, and that is saving our binding and then reloading it when the player comes back so that their preferences get saved and they don't have to redo the bindings every time they play your game. So we're going to do the majority of that work over in our input manager. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and we're going to create two new functions. The first is going to be a private static function. This is going to be save binding override, and we're going to input the input action itself. And again, we're not inputting the name of the action. This is, again, private. It's internal to input manager. So we're going to have reference to the actual action. A little out of whack there. There we go. Fix that. So here what we're going to do, I'm going to use player prefs. Now, if you're using a more sophisticated save system like your own or easy save or something like that, you can adapt this to work perfectly well with that. But for me, it makes sense to use player prefs. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the bindings on this action and save them to player prefs. So for loop, and we're going to loop through actions bindings, which is an array count. And then for each one of these, we're going to do a player prefs set string, because we're going to be saving the binding, which is just a string. And we're going to give this a name of action map plus action name plus I. And the reason I'm including the action map in there is just in case you have the same action on different input action assets or different action maps. I want to make sure that there's a bigger string here. So if you have like move in a boat action map and move in a car action map, they don't override. You may or may not need that. And then what we're going to save is the action bindings from that index, the override path. So the way Unity does this is that there is a path. There's a default path that has the value you as a designer set in the input action asset. And then there's an override path, which is what it looks for during runtime. And so we're going to grab that path and save that as a string. Then in our next function, which is going to load the binding, we're going to go grab that path and set that as the override path. Hope that makes sense. All right, so this one's going to be public static void. And the reason it's public is this is going to get called from the ReBind UI. We're going to do load binding override. And we're going to pass in the action name. Again, this time we're using the action name because it's going to get called from the UI, which only has reference to the name. Just like before, we're going to do check and see if the input actions is null. If it is, we're going to create a new instance of it. Again, I've just got some race conditions. I'm not entirely sure why, but this solves it. We're going to have to get a reference to that action. Input actions, asset, find action, and we're going to pass in that action name like so. Then what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the bindings in that action. So action bindings count like so. And the reason we're going to loop through all of them is it's just easier rather than having to pass in the binding index and find that exact one. It's just simpler. Maybe not as efficient, but I don't think that's a major concern. So what we're going to do is we're going to check and see if we have a saved value. So we're going to do string is empty or null. And we're going to do player prefs get string And we're going to grab this thing up here that we saved it as and stick it in there. And I'm copying and pasting it just so I don't make a mistake. It's a really easy way to get an error. So if it's not null or empty, then we're going to override it. So action apply binding override. And this is going to be, we pass in the binding index, and then we pass in the binding path, which is this player prefs string right here. And that's it. Even if it doesn't feel like a that's it moment, these are the functions we need to save and load our bindings. Now we just need to call those functions. So I'm going to scroll up here to our do rebind. If our operation is complete, we're going to save our binding. I'm going to come down here and we're going to call save binding override, and I'm going to pass in the action to rebind. Simple as that. Then to load this, we want to be loading it from the UI because that's the piece that's associated with the actual action. I'm going to come back to the ReBind UI, and here on enable, we're going to check here if the input action reference isn't null. And if it's not, we're going to call input manager load binding override, and we're going to pass in the action name like so. All right. So we're going to go back into Unity and see if this all works. We go into play mode. We still have the space as the default key. If I override that to B, that works. We go out of play mode, and you'll notice the UI goes back to that spacebar. That's okay. Go back into play mode, and we should load up. There's our B, and if I press B, it's working. Our binding has been saved. All right, so we're almost done, and I actually thought we were, but when I sat down to edit this video, I realized I missed one of the steps, which was to create the reset binding function. So let's do that now. We're going to jump back into the input manager, add a function, and then call that function from the ReBind UI. So what we're going to do here is create another public static function, return void, and this one's just going to be reset binding. And then we're going to pass in string for the action name, since this is getting called from the ReBind UI. We're also going to pass in the binding index. Now, really what we need to do here is simply, for each binding, we need to call a remove override binding extension function. And that just, Unity then just sets the binding back to whatever you, the game developer, set in Unity. It's pretty straightforward, but there are a few things that we need to do first. So since we're passing in the action name, we need to get the actual action, just like we've been doing so far. So it's input actions asset, find action, we find it by name. And then we're going to check and see if this action is null, or we also want to make sure that the action or the binding index exists. So we're going to do just like we did before and check and see if the count is less than or equal to the binding index. If either of those are true, that means we can't find the binding. We're just going to print you, the developer, a message. Not 100% necessary, but I kind of like to do it. Reminds me, it lets me know something's going wrong. And then what we need to do, we need to check and see if this action binding, the binding index, is a composite. Because again, remember that these composite bindings are a series of bindings. And so if we're going to reset a composite binding, we need to loop through. We're going to use a for loop through and reset each individual binding. If that is true, we're going to loop through. And we are going to go from I equals binding index to action bindings count. And now this is a little bit different because we're going to do something that I haven't really seen before. But this second piece of the for loop is actually a Boolean statement evaluating whether this is true. Usually we're just talking about numbers, but we can make it a more general Boolean. So we're also going to check and make sure that this action binding at I is a composite. If it's not a composite, we want to stop. We're all done with our for loop. Then all we need to do is call action remove binding override and feed in the index of what we want to override. If it's not a composite, we're going to do something very similar. We're just going to use the binding index that gets sent in when this function gets called. So again, we're playing around with indices a little bit because we have a composite, but not terribly complex. Again, the idea is we're just going through every binding that's associated with this action, this binding that we want to reset, and calling this extension function of remove binding override. The last step is to hop over to the ReBind UI And here in the reset binding, we need to call that new function that we just created. So input manager, reset binding. We need to pass in the action name and the binding index. And one last step, I'm gonna call update UI when this binding has been reset. Now you could create another action in the input manager. Whenever a binding gets reset, that action gets invoked. This feels pretty clean to me as well. So let's go back into Unity and see how well this works. Going into play mode, you can see here that currently the jump is set to H. I can press H, I can jump. If I press reset, it goes back to space, and then I can press the space bar to reset it. So not only are we resetting the UI, we're actually resetting the binding itself. So there you go. It's definitely long, no matter how I choose to edit this up. I hope this was interesting and better yet useful for you and your project. If it was, check out these other videos that Unity thinks you should watch. And until next time, happy game designing.